Greetings everyone. Welcome to this video. My name is Charles Bernard and I am a professional paperback book cover illustrator who also founded the Online Art Academy, where you can learn the all-important fundamentals without spending a fortune learning them. This video is an introduction to how order can be achieved within a picture. The beginner has no clue how order can be achieved. Therefore, when the beginner starts to draw a picture, he or she draws without any conception of what it takes to create an orderly composition. In this video, I'm going to just briefly introduce you to how that order can be achieved, and it needs to be imposed upon the subject that you draw or paint. It's not going to happen by itself just because you are doing a drawing. You need to have the knowledge of what it actually is that will impose order upon the subject that you're drawing or painting. And in this video, I'm going to introduce you to how order can be imposed upon the subject by way of some kind of plan that brings order to the subject. And therefore, this plan is called a plan of organization. Beginners have no clue how to do this. And I'm going to show you a very easy way that it can be done. Art is man-made order. Therefore, the beginner who wants to advance as an artist needs to know how this order is achieved. The beginner's drawings and paintings are represented here by these lines that I'm making. And there is no order here. The lines are all over the place. To achieve order, there needs to be some kind of regularity. So if I do this, now there's order. This is disorder, this is chaos, this is order. But this is a rather boring order. It's too regular. So to make a picture more interesting, there needs to be irregularity. But that irregularity is also order. So what I can do is, instead of making a repetition of the lines like this that has this regularity to it, I could add irregularity. And by doing this, changing the sizes and position and the intervals between these lines, I now have an irregular order that is much more interesting than this order here. When you look at this example, which represents the beginner's drawings and paintings, disorder, because the beginner doesn't know how to achieve order. So when you look at this, you can see these lines here going in all sorts of different directions, all over the place. But when you look at this example, you can see that these lines are parallel. They're all going in the same direction. They all have this vertical direction to them. And this is what creates this order, because they all have the same direction. And the same goes for this. There's order here because they all have that same direction, that vertical direction. They're all parallel to each other. But this is much more interesting because of the variety that exists here, which doesn't exist in this example. And here there's too much variety, too many different directions. When you have the same directions like this or like that, you achieve order, because one line relates to the other line, and that line to the other line, and so on. They are linked, they are connected through this sameness of direction. The focus of this video is on showing you how order is achieved, and getting away from this sort of disorder that is representative of beginner's work. And I'm going to be showing you some very simple examples which illustrate how you need to start how you need to get this idea of creating order and how that order is achieved into your head, into your thinking, into your memory. As always, the best way to begin, if you are a beginner, not knowing what the elements of picture making are that make a really great painting, you first need to learn those elements in terms of very simple examples, very simple rough thumbnail sketches. You don't begin by being introduced to complicated looking drawings or paintings. You have to first learn these things that make a great painting in very simple abstract terms, in very simple sketches, thumbnail sketches, like I'm going to be showing you at the beginning of this video, and then I'll move into more complex looking pictures. But if you don't understand what I'm going to be showing you in very simple drawings, then you're certainly not going to be able to understand it in more complicated looking drawings and paintings. So therefore, I'm going to start off by doing some very simple sketches, as I said. The best way that you're going to be able to learn what I'm going to be showing you is if you participate and not just passively watch the video. That is, try to do what I'm doing and follow along what I'm suggesting you should do. First of all, you need to make a format shape, as it's called, like this kind of rectangle, a long rectangle like that. Then, in my case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to roughly sketch in these pineapples. So here's a pineapple. Now you don't have to use the same subject. You can use something else, or you can just copy what I'm doing. Then this pineapple, and it doesn't matter how accurate it looks, it doesn't matter at all. The only thing that matters is that you get some kind of shape down. So what I'm going to do, and what you need to do, is once you've drawn your subject, whether it's this pineapple or maybe an apple or a banana or whatever it is that you want to draw, once you've drawn it, then repeat it, like I'm doing now. Then repeat it again. So now I have 3 of these pineapples. Then I'm going to add something else, a different subject. Not a pineapple, but rather, let's say, a bowl that has some fruit in it. And I could add a pineapple also. Now, the thing here is that by doing something like this, order is achieved. And the reason an order has been achieved is because this little picture here is based on a plan. And that plan, because it brings order to the subject, is called a plan of organization. And I talk a lot about this in my complete illustration art course. But here I'm giving you a brief introduction to this concept. So if you do something like this, you've established order, and also you've established various compositional elements as well. This plan can be called repetition, because I'm repeating this pineapple, culminating in a dominant climax. This bowl of fruit becomes dominant because it stands apart from the fruit here, because it's so different. Therefore it stands apart and becomes dominant. And it is the climax. And because it's the climax, it becomes the center of interest, the most important part in this little picture. So if you do something like this, or something similar to what I did, you will have based your picture on this plan that I just mentioned. Repetition culminating in a dominant climax. So you draw one object, like I did, and then repeat that object so that it looks the same, and you repeat it 3 times, like I did. And then the 4th time you draw something that is different, just as I did here. And this is what you need to practice many times. don't start introducing a lot of different elements. Just select one element, and maybe this element that I'm selecting now is an apple. And what I'm doing is I'm repeating that apple 3 times, like that. And then, for the 4th element, I'm going to add something different. The 4th object doesn't have to be a fruit. Maybe, let's say, this alarm clock. So now I have repetition culminating in a dominant climax. And some of the other elements of composition that I've also established here, for example, is movement. The eye follows these apple shapes, starting here, and then moving to the next one, and the next one, and then on to the dominant climax. So I've already established here order as well as compositional movement. And the same goes for this. The eye follows these pineapples from this one to that one to that one, and then to the dominant climax. So if you're a beginner and you've done various drawings, I know that your drawings will lack what I've indicated here, because your drawings are going to be too complicated. They're going to have too many elements. You have to keep it simple. And this is what you need to practice over and over to really burn this into your memory, so that you thoroughly understand the importance of this. So let's move on to yet another example. In this example, let's say I'm going to quickly draw some bottles. So there's one bottle, then I'm going to repeat that bottle. And it doesn't have to look exactly like the first bottle. And I'll repeat that again. And then for the 4th object, maybe I'll sketch in this teapot. So here again, I have this plan of organization called repetition culminating in a dominant climax. And I have compositional movement. The eye is moving along these bottles to the center of interest. So you see how easy it is to get order into your pictures, and some of these compositional elements that would otherwise be missing if you did a drawing that looked rather complicated because you added all these different shapes, these different subjects, which is typical of the drawings of beginners. They don't know how to simplify. And here is an example of simplification. That's all you need to do. You just need to simplify. But the problem is, beginners, they tend to make everything more complex. They haven't learned the importance of being simple. They really don't know how to simplify. But here I'm showing you how to simplify. This is how you should start. In a very simple way, according to this plan of organization that I've introduced you to. You might be thinking, well, this is too simple. It's really not, because as I've already pointed out to you, there are several compositional elements at work, even within these simple sketches, which doesn't appear in the work of beginners. They tend to complicate things too much. You have to keep it simple, because in this simplicity there actually is quite a bit of complexity, which I've already started pointing out to you, such as the compositional movement that is established here. The eye is moving from one shape to the other, and there is a center of interest. The eye culminates in this center of interest. There's direction. The eye is moving from the left toward the right. And this little picture has dominance of shape. The reason why there's dominance of shape here is because there are more of these bottle shapes here than of this teapot shape. And therefore, there is shape dominance. Although the teapot is the center of interest, and the eye is drawn to it because it is so different from these bottles. But there is also dominance of shape, as I just mentioned, because I have more of these bottle shapes than I do of this teapot shape. Also, there's a horizontal direction that is established, although this kind of arrangement lacks the kind of variety of placement that is necessary to make pictures more interesting. But I want you to keep it simple for now, so therefore stick to the kind of arrangement that I've been using here in these examples. Don't try to make things more complicated. You're also establishing contrast. When you establish a simple composition like this, and that's what it is a composition. Doesn't matter that it's very simple like this. When you do this, you're also establishing contrast, because the teapot here contrasts with the bottles. The bottle shapes are different from the teapot shape, and the teapot is a different object than the bottles. So there's this contrast, and contrast is another one of those important principles of design that needs to be applied to whatever drawing or painting you do. And the same goes for this example here. This bowl of fruit has a different shape than the pineapple. So there's contrast introduced as well. And because the teapot and the bottles are different, I get variety. And variety is what makes a painting or a drawing more interesting. You need to get this kind of variety into every drawing and painting. Otherwise, if you don't get variety in there, the painting or drawing becomes monotonous looking. You also introduce unity when you do what I've done here. Because when you repeat a shape like I did here with these bottles, or with the pineapples or the apples, unity is established as well. And unity is probably the most important principle of design. So you're already getting that into your work if you follow what I've been showing you here. So you see, what you might have thought of as being too simple actually has some complexity to it and fulfills certain requirements of what is considered a good picture. Of course, these simple sketches lack many of the requirements for a great picture, but nevertheless, they also contain many of the requirements for a great picture. And you, as a beginner, if you are a beginner, and you apply what I've shown you, you're already leaping ahead quite a bit from those other beginners who are totally unaware of what I've pointed out to you here and do these complicated looking drawings with all sorts of different shapes and different objects, and everything looks too complicated and basically a mess. Of course, when you follow what I've shown you, your work will also have simplicity. But as I pointed out to you, there will be complexity within that simplicity. In addition to the simplicity that your sketches are going to have if you follow what I've been telling you, they will also have pattern as well as rhythm. The pattern is established by the repetition of the shape, in this case the bottle shape, and in this case the pineapple shape being repeated, sets up a pattern as well as a rhythm, and the same goes for these apples here as well. If you take a look over here, you can see that I changed the teapot to this large bottle. And that's because I want to point out to you that you could introduce a fourth element or object that is the same as the three objects that are repeated. But when you introduce that fourth object that is of the same subject, you make it look different so that it stands apart from the three objects. And this then makes that fourth object dominant, so that you have that plan of organization which is repetition culminating in a dominant climax. But to be more precise, is actually repetition of shape and object, culminating in a dominant climax. So there's a repetition of object because all three of these are the same object. They are all bottles. Or, for example, the pineapples. I could have a large pineapple in the foreground here, something like this, and I still get that repetition culminating in a dominant climax plan of organization. These pineapples are moving the eye over toward the big pineapple. So there's this culmination in a dominant climax. The pineapple that is in the foreground becomes dominant through size, just as this bottle here becomes dominant because of its larger size than the other bottles. So the eye is attracted to this big bottle here, just as the eye is attracted to this big pineapple. You could do some sketches of animals. It doesn't have to be inanimate objects, still life objects like I've been drawing. So let's say maybe you want to draw some swans. So do it quick and rough. Remember, don't spend a lot of time doing these drawings. The idea is to get all of those things into the sketches that I pointed out, and you can get them in there without making beautiful looking drawings. And then I'll add another swan over here, so I have three. Establish the pattern, some reflections in the water, and then right over here, where this movement needs to culminate, the movement along these swans, I could maybe put some land area here, some grass, and maybe there's a twig here, and on that twig there maybe sits a bird, like that. So now I have this plan of organization that I've been telling you about. I have repetition culminating in a dominant climax. This is my dominant climax. It's the center of interest. The center of interest is the dominant climax. So you see, if you follow what I've been showing you, you also, in addition to all those other things that I pointed out to you, you also end up with a center of interest, which is another important element of composition that you must have in your pictures. And in addition, this quick rough sketch also has all those other compositional elements that I pointed out to you. Following what I've been showing you will enable you to start thinking in more simple terms and getting these important compositional elements into your work, even though you may be a beginner just starting to learn what it's all about, but makes great pictures. So even though you're at this early stage, if you do what I'm telling you, you are really way ahead of other beginners that aren't doing this. Now, as I mentioned, these sketches follow a plan of organization. And it is this plan of organization that you need to establish in your practice work. Doing a lot of sketches of different subjects, following what I showed you, and thinking in terms of this plan of organization, which is going to enable you to get all of those compositional elements that I talked about into your sketches. This is one of the most important lessons you're going to learn. Because you, being a beginner, if you are a beginner that is watching this, doesn't really know that order needs to be imposed upon whatever you are drawing or painting. And the beginner doesn't know how that order is achieved. And here you are learning that order is achieved through a plan of organization, and in this case that plan of organization is called repetition culminating in a dominant climax. There are other plans, however, which you'll learn about in my complete illustration art course, and I go into this much more than what you're getting here. I decided to bring back the previous sketches in which that fourth element is a different object. And my suggestion is that the fourth element that you do add should be a different object, even though it could be a similar object to the first three. And the reason for that is because by introducing a different object, I've introduced another important element of composition, which is called novelty. The introduction of novelty, something completely different from the other objects. This will add a lot more interest to your picture than if you use the same kind of object. In addition, the eye will be attracted to that novel object much more quickly, and there'll be no doubt as to what is the center of interest. Now, initially, when you're doing your practice sketches, you follow the arrangement that I made here in these sketches. But then, after you feel confident that you really understand this and are able to apply what I've been showing you to different subjects that you're going to be doing quick sketches of, and you've done a lot of sketches following this kind of arrangement, then you can start adding variations. You can then change, for example, the size of one of the three shapes. So, for example, these three swans here, you could change the size of one of them by placing one of them in a different position so that they don't all look lined up. In other words, you can then vary the position of those three objects, and thereby you're beginning to add variety of placement. So here you can see I'm just quickly adding this swan further down so that he's closer toward the bottom border and looks a little bit bigger than the other swans. Thereby the other swans appear to be further back in space. So now I've introduced variation of size and placement. A different placement has been given to this swan. And this is what you then apply to your other practice sketches that you're going to be doing. And that will then make your pictures even more interesting if you apply that variation. And just apply change of placement and size like I did here. And you see how much more interesting this sketch now looks than the way it looked before I made that change. Now take a look up here. I'm going to make a quick change to that one also, and you can see that I've made the middle pineapple smaller in size. So now I've introduced variation. So I have repetition with variation, as it's called, culminating in a dominant climax. That's the plan of organization now, as opposed to what it was previously. Previously it was repetition culminating in a dominant climax. Now it's called repetition with variation because I changed the size of that pineapple, culminating in a dominant climax. So this adds one additional element of complexity. So now you do a lot of practice work adding that variation of size and placement. The pineapple also has been changed in its placement. It's been put further back. So there's also now variation of placement besides variation of size. Then, one more additional element of complexity can be added, but only after you really feel confident in doing these kind of sketches with this kind of plan of organization. Then you can move on to overlapping the shapes or objects. Now let me give you examples of overlapping. So take a look over here. I'm going to place an even larger swan in the foreground here. And look what I'm doing. I'm overlapping this swan here with this one. Get rid of that one back there, like this. So now I've introduced overlapping. This is an additional complexity So something like this. And there's a compositional movement. The eye's following these swans like this, all the way to the dominant climax right there. And now I'm going to move to this and move it over toward the bottle. So now this is overlapping this bottle here. So I've introduced overlapping. And then I can also make one of these bottles, let's say this one, larger in size. So I'm also introducing variation of size as well as variation of position, because this bottle has now been placed in the foreground. I have two separate groups. This is one group and this is another group. Don't have separate groups like that, so therefore I'm going to introduce another bottle in the background right there that is now connecting those two groups. So there's just one big group now. You can have smaller disconnected groups from the main group, but I'm not going to go into that. So what has been done is another element of complexity has been introduced. And now I also want to mention that do not start doing rough sketches jumping right ahead to overlapping and adding different placements of the objects like I've been showing you. That is a bit more advanced. You need to start with the more simple arrangement that I began with, where everything was lined up. And then you progress to adding variations of size and placement and overlapping, but you need to take it one step at a time. Don't jump right ahead to the more complex sketches. Also, another thing before I end this video, don't have your shapes spread apart like that. That's why I talked about overlapping. So you need to bring the shapes together and overlap them. And I'm going to move this shape over like that and overlap it with the one further back. I'm doing this real quick. And then this bowl here can be brought over. So this is just a quick example, just to show you that you shouldn't have them spread apart like that. They need to be brought together and overlapped. When the beginner begins a drawing, he or she begins without this knowledge of having some kind of plan in mind or something that will create order. Not knowing how to impose order upon the subject, the beginner will proceed to start drawing, beginning with maybe a head of some kind of creature if he or she is drawing a science fiction or fantasy picture, and the beginner then just continues drawing whatever it is that he or she is drawing without having any clue as to having some idea in mind as to what is going to bring order to this drawing. And of course there are many things that are missing within the sketch of a beginner, and the beginner has no awareness of exactly all the things that are missing. So the beginner just continues working blindly, so to speak, without that knowledge of what will bring order to the drawing that he or she is doing. And as you can see, this is just a crude, rough representation of what a beginner's drawing might look like. So then the beginner will continue to add other things, such as maybe a castle back here. So again, the beginner just starts drawing in the castle without any idea as to how that castle will relate to this creature. So the beginner thinks, well, I like to maybe add some buildings back here, so I'm going to add some buildings, and I think I'm going to add a road here. So the beginner just keeps adding more and more things, and eventually the picture will look crowded, it will look cluttered, and maybe there's a wall here and a door to the castle, and then maybe there should be a figure standing here. And the figure is holding maybe a weapon. Eventually, as the beginner continues to work on his or her drawing or painting, they will essentially end up with something of this quality. And it will lack that organization that is representative of a really good picture or a really great picture. While there might be some order here because of the overlapping of the shapes, placing them one against the other like this, having the big monster in the back here, it isn't the kind of composition that is based on a plan of organization, which would bring much more order to the composition. Remember, art is man-made order. If your art lacks order, it also lacks art. I went ahead and I redid this rough sketch that is representative of beginner's work, and I'm going to show you what that sketch looks like that I did, which is based on a plan of organization. And here it is. And I think you can see a dramatic difference between this sketch and this rough sketch. This one appears much more orderly, much more interesting than this does. In my rough sketch here, the picture is based on the plan of organization that I've been talking about, which is repetition of shape and object culminating in a dominant climax. So the object that is repeated is, of course, the human figure. And it is also the shape that is repeated. The human figure shape is repeated. And the dominant climax is, of course, the monster here. This plan of organization has that kind of variety of placement and of different sizes that I talked about. So here's a large size, a middle size, smaller size, and then an even bigger size here. And then this figure has been placed in the foreground, while this one is further back in space, and this one is even further back. So there is this variety of placement as well. And then the eye is drawn here to the head of this monster because that's where the strongest value contrast is located. And there is a compositional movement or eye path that goes like this, following that monster, taking in the whole picture, and then going back to where that figure is. So there's this orderly arrangement of shapes, and the way they have been arranged helps to create this movement also. There's also overlapping that occurs. Remember, I talked about applying overlapping to those simple drawings, which would then make them more complex than having the shapes all lined up like on a shelf. So here are the shapes lined up like on a shelf, and then there's this shape that is different, a bowl. And in this picture here, that novelty or that different shape or object is, of course, the monster. So there's this repetition of the same object with the figures, but then the fourth object is a different object, which is the monster. So looking up here, that plan of organization seen in very simple terms would be the plan that I showed you in those rough thumbnail sketches, where there is overlapping occurring, variety of sizes and of placement, and then culminating in a dominant climax. So that's the dominant climax here. and there's overlapping going on, just as there's overlapping going on here. There is, of course, overlapping going on in this example as well, but there are many other things missing which this example has, which makes this a more orderly arrangement than this. For those of you who have watched my other videos on how to create order, you will have learned that order is achieved through a design theme. And what I've been talking about in this video is a design theme. There are different ways to achieve order. And I've been talking about one of those ways, which is this principle of repetition with variation of size and shape culminating in a dominant climax. But looking at this rough sketch here that represents the quality of a beginner's work, there is some order here, as I mentioned earlier. The order in this sketch results from the fact that all of these shapes are overlapping each other. So you have the foreground figures overlapping with that monster in the background. The monster's overlapping with the buildings further back and the castle over here. The dragon is overlapping with the castle. So all of this overlapping is taking place, which creates order. But this example doesn't have the kind of order that is found here. In this example, as I mentioned, there is a greater amount of order. There is this compositional movement, also this figure pointing in toward the center of interest, which is that dragon. So the eye is also moving in the direction that this figure is moving in to these other figures, which are also pointing to this dragon. So there's this kind of movement here, and then where the dragon is located, there's that movement also into the picture. So there's this organization of movement as well, this organized movement that doesn't exist in this example. So while there is some order in this example here, there isn't enough order to make it a really good picture. So when the beginner does a sketch like this, in which this kind of overlapping occurs, that is accidental. And that's because the beginner doesn't know about the importance of overlapping. So any overlapping that occurs is an accident. And that's not how you construct pictures. That's not how you plan compositions, by relying on chance or accident to make a good picture. You have to know what you're doing. So you have to be conscious of the fact that when you do overlap shapes, when you bring them together, when you mass them, in other words, you are also establishing a certain amount of order as well. It's like this, for example. If I drew that monster over here like this, it's really quick, and then I drew a figure standing over here, and then there's the castle back here, and then maybe some buildings back there as well, like this. And there's a road. You see, all these shapes here are not overlapping. And the effect is one of disorder. The shapes are scattered around. But as soon as they are massed, that is, brought together, and a mass is created, like in this example here, then order results from this bringing the shapes together and overlapping them. And you can see that in my example right here. See how all the shapes have been overlapped? They all form a cohesive whole. There isn't this kind of scattering of shapes like you see in this example here. And because my sketch has this kind of overlapping, it has order. But it's not just the overlapping, as I stated earlier. It's also this compositional movement and many other things that contribute to making this a more orderly composition than this. But this overlapping, this massing, this bringing together the shapes and overlapping them, that is a very important part of establishing order. Watch what happens when I mass these shapes, when I bring them together and overlap them. So I'm going to take that monster and these other objects and then just overlap one with the other like this, and then bring the figure forward, and then those buildings are in back of the monster, and then I'll just roughly sketch in the road here like this. Now, looking at this example and this one, I think you can clearly see that this example looks much more orderly than this does. So you see what overlapping can do to a picture? It can bring order to the picture, as I've said. So this is a very important principle to apply to your compositions. Don't scatter your shapes like in this example. Mass them. That is, bring them together like this and create a mass. With this really rough sketch here, I'm showing you another way through which order is achieved. Just by overlapping the shapes, bringing them together, overlapping them, and this creates a cohesive whole. So here I'm just adding some dark tone to his trousers, and then the light tone of his shirt, which makes him stand out against that dark value of the monster. And this also adds another important principle of design, which is the principle of alternation that I teach you about in my course. And the alternation occurs because there is this light value of his shirt against the dark mass of the monster, and then it changes down here where his trousers are. Here it's a dark tone against a light background. So it's like this, light against dark, and then it alternates to dark against light. Now here's another plan of organization, and I'm just going to do a little diagram here, and you can see this diminishing of sizes, and this is gradation, the principle of design called gradation. So that becomes the plan of organization. Gradation is the plan, gradation is the design theme. A design theme is a plan, and a plan is a design theme. And I'm going to do a quick copy of an illustration by the great Bernie Fuchs. It's going to be very rough, and he did this illustration of a car, large car in the foreground. It's going to be very rough. It's done in real time, doing it very quick, just to show you what his illustration looks like based on this plan of organization. So he has this car with the soldiers in the vehicle, and they're firing their weapons, and there's another car further back, right around here. He overlaps this car just a little bit with the car in the front. So that car roughly looks something like this. And there are figures on this. It's actually a truck. So on the back of this truck there are these figures that are standing there. And then he adds another car, or it's actually another truck. So he's got one car in the foreground and two trucks further back, And this third vehicle, that truck way back there, he doesn't overlap it with this truck, but he brings that shape of the truck very close to this shape of the truck. And let me just quickly rough that in. And what you're seeing here is this plan of organization. You see that Bernie Fuchs based his entire composition on that principle of design called gradation. You see how these vehicles get smaller as they go further back in space, just like in this example here. And that creates order. That brings order to his picture, to his composition. The vehicles are actually larger, so they fill up more of the picture space, something like this. And that's more accurate. With this great illustration by Bernie Fuchs, you can see how easily he brings order to his composition by applying a principle of design, which in this case is the principle of gradation. And this more complex illustration can be reduced to a simple diagram like that, because here you see gradation and here you see gradation. Now in this example I should have brought these shapes closer together, because that's the way Bernie Fuchs has arranged his shapes here. They're close together. But this is enough to get across to you the importance of applying a principle of design such as gradation to your picture in order to bring order to it. So let me bring back that other plan that I showed you at the beginning of the video. And that plan is, of course, the repetition of shape and object culminating in a dominant climax. And in this case, the dominant climax is rather small, but it still dominates. It attracts your attention more than these larger shapes. And then you use your imagination to come up with all sorts of different arrangements based on these simple plans. So I could have something like this, for example, in which I'm using the plan of gradation of sizes, just like in this example and here, gradation of size. So what I'm doing here is adding the smaller shape in the middle, and then the middle shape over here. There's still a gradation of sizes, but it's not in a more regular way like you see in this example. It's more irregular. You don't have that gradual diminishing of sizes like this. This is a variation on this plan of organization of gradation of sizes. You have to use your imagination, like I said, to come up with different arrangements. There are so many possibilities. And these plans will bring order to your picture. Now another plan that I haven't talked about yet is using dominance of size. So for example, if I do something like this, in which I have this large shape here like that, and then I add a smaller shape over here, this is my plan of organization. It becomes organized because of this dominance of this shape. Dominance helps to create unity. Unity through dominance. And unity brings order to a picture or a composition. Take a look up here where I did this rough sketch of Bernie Fuchs's painting. And I'm going to eliminate one of those vehicles there, that truck in the distance. And then I'll come in with the picture border somewhat like that. And get rid of this. And what you're seeing now is this dominance that I established over here. You see how large the car is in the foreground? It dominates in size. Just like in this example here, this shape dominates in size. And then I have this truck back here, which is smaller in size, just like this small shape here in this example. So this sketch now is based on this plan here. This plan in which I am using the principle of design called dominance. And because I'm basing this sketch on that principle of dominance, I have order in this picture. To learn about additional plans of organization, check out my other videos on plans of organization. And those other plans are plans like alternation and pattern, for example, in addition to what I've shown you here. So you have all these different plans that you can use to bring order to your pictures. So far, I've given you very simple and quick examples of this plan of organization called repetition culminating in a dominant climax. And now I'm going to show you a more complex example that shows you what can be done with this kind of plan, how far it can be taken. What I'm going to show you is a quick color sketch that I'm going to be doing, but first I'll start off by doing a quick thumbnail sketch like I've been showing you in this video. I have this idea in mind for a science fiction painting, and what I'm going to do is show you how I begin. And I begin the way I've shown you in this video, and that is to start with some kind of plan of organization in mind, which in this case, as you know, is the plan called repetition culminating in a dominant climax. So I begin with thumbnail sketches like I've been showing you, and I'm thinking of maybe this robot here that has several arms like this, and then I'm going to repeat that robot like this with some variations, but the general shape of the robot will be kept so that I don't lose the association between the shapes. And if I lose the association, then I lose the feeling of repetition of a shape, which results in a composition that doesn't have rhythm, because rhythm is established by repetition. So here I have these three robots, and then I need something that will be the center of interest, and I think I'm going to add this woman sitting on a rock, and she's holding some kind of weapon or something and pointing it toward these robots, and there's light coming out of this weapon. It looks something like a flashlight, and she's trying to ward off these robots that are coming toward her. They don't have friendly intentions. And then let's say there's a wagon back here that's loaded up with her things. She was ready to leave this house that is over here on the right side. You can see some of that house. And then all of a sudden these robots show up in this field of grass. And there's a setting sun. So I'm thinking of all of these things while I'm doing this little rough thumbnail sketch. Now, this is the procedure that you should follow. Once you have a thumbnail sketch worked out, then you move on to doing a larger sketch, which then is used to paint the picture with. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing because that would take way too long, but I'll just roughly sketch in some of these robots, and then I'm going to show you the finished rough color sketch. It's just a sketch, it's not a finished painting. So here are these robot shapes that I'm repeating. So there's this repetition of shape culminating in a dominant climax. And the dominant climax, as I said in my little sketch here, is this woman sitting on a rock. She's holding this weapon, pointing it at the robots. And then back here is that wagon that she has loaded up with all her stuff. The horizon line is back here. Some birds flying. And then the house over here. So she was planning to leave this place, and then she encountered these robots coming toward her. So here's a very rough sketch. Now, before I move on to showing you the finished rough color sketch, what you also need to know about is how to create tonal structures or value patterns. And what I'm going to do here is just quickly try to come up with some kind of value pattern. And the best way is to first do these little thumbnail sketches, thinking of what the value pattern could be. And you start with the dominant value, and I need to soften my brush here, something like this maybe. So the dominant value is maybe this value here. Now, I'm not going to go into teaching you about value patterns in this video. There's no way that you're ever going to learn everything you need to know from one video. But at least I'm introducing you to some of the elements of picture making. And establishing a value pattern is one of those elements of picture making. So you begin with the dominant value. You determine whether it's to be lighter or middle value or darker. And then what I'm going to do is add a darker value. And that darker value could represent these robots here that I just quickly roughed in like that. They could form this dark mass. And that dark mass, as you can see here in my little abstract diagram, is leading the eye in this direction toward the dominant climax, which is right there. So the value pattern shape that I've established here has a direction, and it leads the eye in a certain direction, and in this case, as I pointed out to you, it leads the eye to the center of interest. So all of this would be a dark mass, and then in order to emphasize the center of interest here, I can add a lighter value like this, creating a strong value contrast of light and dark like this. It draws the eye here, emphasizing the center of interest. And then I can add a lighter value here as well, so that I don't just have one light value here, but I also have a few others like this. And this could be my value pattern. That's how quickly you can work out a value pattern using these little thumbnail sketches. It's not a good idea to go right to the large picture and then start working out a value pattern like this on the large drawing. And the reason for that is because if you make these little thumbnail sketches, you can do a lot of them quickly, faster than if you worked large like this. So if this one doesn't work out, then I can quickly move to some other value pattern. So maybe another value pattern could be something like this, in which I make the dominant value dark. And when I'm talking about dominant value, I'm talking about the value that takes up the greatest amount of area. So right here, you can see that all of this is this dark value. And then what I could maybe do is add a lighter value for those robots. And again, that mass of value is leading to the dominant climax, which is located right here, where the woman is. And maybe that's all that I need to do. So this would be a light against a dark value pattern. And in this one up here, there are three basic values. There's the dark right there, then there's the light value right there, and then there's the middle value right there. So there are three values that make up this value pattern, while down here there are only two values that make up the value pattern. So this gives you a small glimpse into how these value patterns are worked out. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about value patterns, then check out my complete illustration art course. I go into value patterns in great detail and show you all sorts of different kinds of value patterns and what they can do for your paintings. Another reason for working out your value patterns in small thumbnail sketches like this is not only does it speed up the whole process because you're working small and not covering a large area, as I pointed out, but you're also not going to get caught up in details, in drawing little details. Also, since you're working small like this, you are focusing only on abstraction. You're only concerned with how does it look as an abstraction, not thinking of any modeling of the forms, not thinking of details, as I said. You're only thinking in tonal masses, flat tonal masses. And that constructs an abstraction like you see here. So if the abstraction looks good and you're able to carry that over into your larger painting, then you can pretty much be certain that if you do everything else correct that is part of what makes a really great picture, your painting is going to look really good. And speaking of doing all those other things correctly that are part of a really good or great painting, one of those additional things is color that needs to be worked out. So what I usually do is I make a little color wheel like this, but before you can use this kind of color wheel idea that I'm introducing you to here, you need to first become familiar with the standard color wheel and all the different colors on that color wheel, which I'm not going to go into here, but you can learn about it in my complete illustration art course. So I make these little color wheels. So for example, I'm thinking first of all, what is going to be the dominant color? Just as I thought, what is going to be the dominant value in these value patterns? So always begin with this idea of first thinking about what is going to be the dominant value or the dominant color. And I'm thinking that maybe for this painting, the dominant color might be green, and green is located right about there on the color wheel. Then I'm thinking about the subordinate color or subdominant color will be red. And maybe an additional color, and that additional color could be maybe blue, which is located around here on the color wheel. So what I have here is what is called a triadic color scheme. And as you can see, it forms this configuration of a triangle when I connect the colors. Just as I used thumbnail sketches to work out my value pattern down here, I can use thumbnail sketches to work out my color scheme and color pattern. And I think I'm going to use this little thumbnail that I did to work out my color scheme. And as I said, I'm thinking of maybe having the green as the dominant color. Therefore, I could add green over the entire little sketch here like this. And then for my subordinate color or subdominant color, I could maybe have these robots here, red. So I have red against green, and this creates conflict, which is the mood of this painting, but not quite. It's more like an impending conflict, a conflict that is about to happen, although I may change my mind on that. So here's a simple color pattern, red against green, and then the blue, I could use that maybe and place that over here on the dominant climax, the woman right there like this, and that's it. And then of course color variations are added, but again, that's not something I can go into here. But a very simple color scheme, a very simple color pattern has been worked out in an abstract manner like this, just as I used abstraction to work out my value pattern down here. First comes the abstraction, then comes the more realistic representation of the subject. If the abstraction doesn't look good, then no matter what you do to that subject in terms of how well you render it, how well you draw it, it's never going to look really great. The abstraction has to be right. That has to be great. And then the more realistic representation of the subject is going to be great. I'm only thinking in simple masses of color, just as I've only thought of simple masses of value for the value pattern. And if I don't like that color scheme, I can quickly switch to some other color scheme that I think might work better. So instead of having this color scheme, which is basically red against green, maybe I could change it a bit and have, let's say, again, the green dominating. Although this time, instead of the robots being red, I think I might change that to a blue. So let's see what that looks like. And then the woman I would make red. So this also creates a stronger emphasis on the woman because there's a stronger contrast of color here, of hue specifically. And if you don't know what hue is, then there again, this is something that you need to learn about color. But hue simply is the name of the color. So the name of this color right here is red. So that's a red hue. So now the robots don't command as much attention because the hue contrast between the blue and the green isn't as strong as the red is with the green. So this creates a stronger center of interest. But then when I have something like this where I have one color on the center of interest, I need to relate that red to another red somewhere else so that it doesn't become isolated and helps the eye to move to other places within the picture. You see, these are just some of the things that I'm introducing you to, making you aware of. And this is color design, this sort of thing. This is what you need to learn. You need to learn all of this stuff. And you can't get it from one video. And you're not going to get it by jumping around to a bunch of videos on the web trying to find the answers. Well, if you're going to do it that way, lots of luck to you, but it can be very frustrating and it will take you a long, long time to get the answers. So that's why it's so important that you take an art course, whether that art course is my art course or some other art course. I'm just letting you know that the fastest way to get to your goal, to become that really good or even great artist that you want to become, is to take a really good art course where you get all of the answers and where you won't be left in a frustrated state because you're all confused. You don't really know what you need to do to produce really great drawings and paintings. Another thing you need to learn is to use color imaginatively and not literally. Literally means that the beginner always thinks the sky is blue, so therefore I need to paint it blue. Well, no, that's not using your imagination to make the very best painting possible. I could make the sky any color I want if that color helps me to establish the mood that I have in mind. So I could have a green sky instead of a blue sky. And matter of fact, when you begin your painting, as you might have seen in some of my videos, if you've watched them, on how to begin a painting, you should first tone the surface so that you're not working on a white surface. And that color can either be a color that harmonizes with most of the colors that you're going to be adding, or a complement to those colors. Another thing that is important for you to know is that the more complicated a composition is, and this one is somewhat complicated because I have 3 robots here, I have a wagon here, and a woman sitting on a rock, there are some buildings back here, so there are quite a few elements here, which makes this a somewhat complicated composition. And the more complicated it is, the more simple the color pattern and color scheme must be, and the more simple the value pattern must be. Because if you have a complex color scheme and a complex value pattern, and then you have a complex composition with all these different elements, and the result is a picture that will look too cluttered, too busy, too complicated, too chaotic, and that results in a rather confusing looking picture. It won't have clarity, and clarity is very important, otherwise the picture is not going to read clearly. So I think I'm going to try this color scheme here, and I'm just going to paint in some of these masses of color like this. I'm not going to paint the entire picture here, showing you all the various steps in painting this picture, but I'm just going to show you the beginning, and as you can see, I'm laying down these masses of blue color, and then the woman over here will have that reddish color, and the sky will be green, the ground will be green, and then some red over here within these robots. And if I need another color, I'm going to add another color, and I might add a yellow, and I think I might have to do that. So therefore, I'm going to go over here to the color picker, select a yellow, and then add it to my little color wheel here. And the yellow is located right at the top of that color wheel, and that changes the configuration somewhat so that it's no longer a triangle shape. It's more like this, more like a rectangle or distorted rectangle. And that yellow color can be placed over here. That's a little too saturated, but I'm not trying to be accurate right here. So that would be in the sky, and then over here where the wagon is, the wagon also is going to be a blue. And that's all I'm going to show you for now. What I'm going to do is jump ahead and show you the finished rough color sketch. So here's what my finished rough color sketch looks like, with these robots and the woman fighting off the robots that are attacking her. And I followed my little rough color sketch here. You can see that the robots are blue, just as they are in my abstract thumbnail sketch, and the center of interest, the woman, is red, just as it is in my little thumbnail sketch. However, I neglected to add the yellow in my little thumbnail sketch right there, which I'm adding now, as you can see. And then over here also where her weapon is. So this is a more accurate representation of what my painting looks like. This is what I should have established in my thumbnail, but sometimes you don't think of these things until you're working on the actual painting. In addition, I also kept the value pattern that I established right there, this dark and light value against a halftone or middle tone. And I'm going to turn this into black and white so that you can see that that pattern has been kept that I established in the thumbnail. You can see that this is the middle tone. This is, of course, the dark, which you see in my thumbnail. And then over here is the light value, and then the light value over here as well, just as you see in my thumbnail sketch. The painting is based on that plan of organization that I've been talking about in the video, which is the repetition of a shape, and the shape being repeated is, of course, the robot, and the object that is being repeated is the robot as well. So it's repetition of shape and object culminating in a dominant center of interest, which is the woman here. She attracts a lot of attention because of the strong hue and value contrast found within this area. The red, seen against the surrounding green color, helps to create strong hue contrast, which attracts attention. And then, of course, the yellow contrasts strongly in hue with the red as well. And then you have the yellow of the sky here, contrasting with the red of her costume. And then there's the value contrast, the dark value of her hair seen against the light value of the sky. So all of this contrast of values and color or hues helps to attract attention to the center of interest here. This color sketch of mine serves as an example that shows you how a simple plan of organization can be applied to a more complex looking painting, not just to simple sketches like these that you saw earlier in the video. Take a look at this little rough sketch here, And you can see this gradation of sizes of these swans that I pointed out to you earlier in the video, culminating in this dominant climax here, as I said. And my painting is based on this idea of the shapes and objects grading in size, or this progression of sizes from large to small. So this little sketch comes closest to my painting. And let me get back to the painting. And you can see this progression of sizes, just as in that little sketch of the swans. So here is the largest size, and then as you can see, the robots are progressing or grading in size toward the smaller robot from large to small, and then culminating in the center of interest here. So that simple plan that was established here in this simple sketch has been applied to this more complicated painting. Of course, there are many other things going on, even in this rough color sketch, that contribute to this painting that I can't go into in one video. So you need to learn all those additional things that I can't go into here. But at least through this video of mine, I hope to have impressed upon you the importance of establishing a simple plan of organization, such as I show you in these simple sketches, which you can then apply to an even more complicated picture like this. I'm going to bring back those simple thumbnail sketches. And if you remember, I started out by telling you that this is the kind of arrangement or composition that you should start out with. Very simple arrangement. Lining the various objects and shapes and forms up like this, so they look like they have been placed on a shelf. Then you move on to a more complicated composition in which you change the position of the objects and shapes, such as in this example where I placed the pineapple further back, and I also overlapped these shapes. So this is a more complex composition than this. But this is how you start out. Do a lot of these kind of practice compositions. Then you move on to a more complex composition like this, where there is this variety of placement and overlapping that occurs. And then you can move on to this kind of composition in which there is this gradation of sizes from large to small, or progression of sizes, that leads the eye over toward the dominant climax or center of interest. And these various things that I just pointed out to you can be found within my color sketch here. The robot shapes overlap each other, so this robot, this one here, is overlapping this one, as you can see right there, and then this robot is overlapping this robot, and then of course there is that gradation of sizes where the robots get smaller as they move further back toward the center of interest here. So there's also this variety of placement that you see in this little thumbnail sketch. And you can see that variety of placement here, where the robot is in the foreground, and then the next robot doesn't line up like shapes on a shelf, but the next robot is placed a little bit further back in space, and then this robot is placed even further back in space. So there is this variety of placement of these shapes. In addition, the fact that the robot shapes are getting smaller as they move further back in space, this creates a feeling of depth or distance or perspective. I didn't have to base my composition on this idea of the gradual change in size of these robots like this, forming this sequence. However, it could also have been done like this, for example, in which there isn't this gradual change of size from large to small, but nevertheless there is change of size taking place. But what I also want to mention is that when you move on to this kind of arrangement here, you could also introduce even more variation of sizes. Right now, this pineapple back here is smaller than these two. But to make the arrangement or composition even more interesting, introduce an even larger pineapple, and maybe I could introduce that larger pineapple right here like this. Now I have more variety of sizes, which helps to create more interest. Now, this is very rough, as you can see, but I think you get the idea. I have a progression of sizes here, but the progression of these sizes isn't in the kind of sequence that I have in my color sketch here, progressing slowly from the largest to the middle size to the smaller size. Here there is still a progression of sizes, but the placement of the shapes or pineapples is staggered. It doesn't follow this kind of regular change in size like that. So I'm showing you that this plan of organization that I've introduced you to can be used in different ways, like I've shown you here in these examples. You have to use your imagination to come up with ideas as to how you can arrange your shapes and forms. And this is one possibility. And then here are those other possibilities. And there are more. You just have to think. Art is about thinking. You have to think, what can I do? How can I use this plan of organization in new and different ways? And now I think this is about as far as I'm going to go with this video. It's time to end it. I hope that you've enjoyed watching it and that you will try to implement what you have learned here into your own drawings and paintings. If you are a beginner, this is how you should start. Don't try to do complicated looking drawings and paintings like this example here without first doing simple thumbnail sketches like this. And once you thoroughly understand how to impose order upon the subject through this plan of organization that I've introduced you to, then you can move on to more complicated looking pictures. But if you're going to try something like this, then you also need to know all of the other things that went into this rough color sketch. And a couple of them I pointed out to you, such as the color and the value pattern. But there are many other things that you need to learn about, which are fundamental to the success of any drawing or painting. So you first have to learn the ABCs of picture making, which is the fundamentals. They are the ABCs of picture making. Without a knowledge of those and an ability to apply them to your drawings and paintings, you're going to remain at that beginner level. If you want to learn a lot more about what I've introduced you to here and all those other fundamentals which are so essential to the success of an artist, which are necessary for you to advance from beginner to more advanced artist to finally a master artist, then check out my complete illustration art course. Thanks for watching. So long.